want to return to the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes was the third book written by King Solomon, and essentially it was written in his waning years, and he had passed through some times of great trouble. He had been very unwise, although he was the wisest man who ever lived. He could tell others what to do, but did not follow that himself. And therefore his soliloquizing here in Ecclesiastes concerning life, and it's very interesting. And we are in chapter 3, and it starts off, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. And so therefore, during this period upon earth, we are governed very much by time. God has his timetable, and we must fit into that timetable of God, whether it be for our generation, whether it be for our nation, whether it be for us personally. God has a plan, and his plan is governed by time. And we all have our watches because we need to know what time it is, because our lives are governed by time. There's a time to get up, there's a time to go to bed. And so we are very governed by time. For example, when we have to travel, well, we are governed by time. We cannot just arrive when we want to arrive at the airport, because there are given times for the departures of the aeroplanes. So in a very real sense, we are governed by time. And there's a time to every purpose under heaven, showing that God has his purposes, and those purposes will be fulfilled at a given time. And therefore, one of the things that we have to understand and know and realize is this, that God has his time, and we must move in the timing of God. Now, with respect to our own lives, there's a time to be born and a time to die. And so there is a particular, shall I say, period in which we are permitted to come upon this earth, and we have an allotted time. It is God who allots our time. And you know, when one is a parent, one does not often think, because one is generally speaking young when one becomes a parent. But I was talking to some parents many years ago, and the wife had just become pregnant. The husband was praying, and God spoke about timing. And this is what the father said to me. He said, God spoke to me that I made my wife pregnant before the time. And because of my age, I've been able to follow the life of that young man, that boy who was born, for many years, over 30 years. And I concur that he was born before his time. Now you might say, why is timing so important in the birthing of a child? Well, let us consider what happens in life. In life, one is born. But in life, according to the timing you go to school, will determine your classmates. And your classmates will have a tremendous impact upon you. that your class will be different to another class. And that social forming of the class that you were intended to be in is perhaps quite different to the one that you were in. Now, obviously, we ourselves don't have any control of when we're born, but as parents, one does. But it was very interesting, this young man, you see, if only he had been born later, it is quite possible that many of the disasters that happened in his life would never have been. He would not have met certain people who influenced his life in a wrong way. He would never have married the person that he did marry, and that would have been a great blessing too. And so you see, there's a time to be born. And when we go through life, you see, we go through in time. And it is important to be born at God's time for our life. But this particular boy, you see, when he was in his mother's womb, God spoke to the father, "No, it's before time." But then, of course, nothing could be done about it, you see. But it was a disastrous, and it has become a disastrous life. Well, as I say, we cannot control the time of our birth. Our time of death, yes, I think we can have a certain control over that. The time of our death, of course, is ordained by God. But in experiencing some of the things in heaven and some of the testimonies that I've read, some have died before their time. And the reason they died before their time, they did not take care of their human body. They committed kinds of bravados, which was almost tempting God, and they died in those circumstances. And the result was, you see, they brought unnecessary pain upon those whom they left behind. The Apostle Paul makes a statement. He said, "No one lives to himself, and no one dies to himself." And when you consider that, that's very, very true indeed. Our lives impact other people's lives. And you see, it's either for good or bad, or a mixture sometimes. You see, we do influence other people. And you see, no one lives to himself. In other words, we are not an isolated entity, but our lives influence other people, either for good or bad, as I said. But also, you see, the Apostle Paul adds this, "And no one dies to himself." And you think, well, if I die, I'm dead and that's it. No, your death will have an impact upon other people. And you see, it's very important that one cares for one's physical body to the degree that we are able to do that, and that we indeed expire at God's appointed time. And if it's earlier, we indeed cause unnecessary sorrow to those whom we leave behind. We have a duty to look after our body and to die at God's appointed time. We had that in a little case with Miss Kenton, our dog. She was suffering. We don't know how much she suffered. She didn't express that to us. She didn't complain. She didn't moan or anything like that. But obviously, she was getting weaker and weaker. And we felt that because God had given that dog to us, or dog to Suzette, through a vision that God had given me, that is very special. And that dog has had an influence in so many countries around the world, people who have not even seen her or had knowledge of her yet, because of illustrations that we were using from her life. Yes, she did have an impact. And we were amazed, you see, even here and elsewhere in the fellowship, that people, were impacted by her death. And we made a decision that because God had given her to us through a vision, then we committed, we laid hands upon her and said, Lord, we're not going to touch her, but we're committing her to you, and we're asking you to take her in your appointed time. And as we look back, we saw the timing was so perfect that she died as Suzette was watching over her, and that very day Suzette moved on to another state, and state of the United States, and, was engaged in other things, and yet she had the satisfaction of knowing that Miss Kenton had passed away, and we buried her in the grounds. And she had an impact in her life and in her death over so many people. Now, she was just a dog. When it's estimated that a pastor of, shall I say, a small congregation impacts in his life over 10,000 people. He may not see 10,000 people. 10,000 people may not see him. But nonetheless, it's like a stone that is dropped in a pool. The circles go out and out and out and out, and they touch the very perimeters of that lake. And so it is in our lives. Our lives might just be a little pebble that falls into the pool of humanity, but it impacts so many. And so it is so important, you see, that we consider this, that our lives do impact people. And we are given the privilege of living so many years upon this life, upon this earth. And it's interesting that some who have lived for very short periods of life have made tremendous impacts, either for good or bad. I take two kings. One, Alexander the Great. Well, he died at the age of 32 years and 9 months. And he is estimated to be one of the cruelest men that ever lived. In fact, there was an image made to him in Athens, and one of his generals, after Alexander had died, was passing by this image, and he just shook and trembled because of the impact of that man's life upon his own, one of fear. And think of all the people that died because of Alexander. And the Roman emperor, Octavius, Augustus Caesar, made this comment. He was so amazed that Alexander was only intent on conquest and wasn't intent on looking after the people that he had conquered. But there's another king, and this king reigned over England, over Denmark, and over Norway. His name was Canute. He lived only 40 years, but he was a very devout man of God, so devout that his counselors, his courtiers, were around him and said, "Oh, you can do anything." And he wanted to prove to them that he could not do everything, that he was just mortal like anybody else. And so he gave the command that his throne be carried out to the seashore. And he said, look, I want you to understand that I'm just mortal like anybody else. And he said, you think that I can give the command and the sea will stop. Well, he had his throne put on the seashore, the sea was out, and he said, I give the command to the sea to stop. Well, the sea did not stop, and the throne had to be hastily retrieved and Canute taken back to the safety of the shore. And the purpose of that was that Canute ended by saying this: there is only one person who is really immortal, only one person in a sense that can do anything he wishes, and that is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. And he said, those are they that I worship. And of course that has been misrepresented, and people have said, oh, Canute in his pride wanted to stop the waves. No, the truth of the matter was not that at all. But this man Canute, you see, reigned not only over England, but over Denmark and over Norway. And because of his piety, many turned, to the Lord. And he had a tremendous influence. In fact, 1,000 years after his death, he is still remembered. But not in, if I could say, the correct sense at times, but there is a new renaissance, shall I say, an interest in his life, and it's on the internet, and the true story is revealed. A very pious man. All right, two people who died, one 32 years, 9 months, the cruelest person that ever lived, and presumably will return as the Antichrist. But Canute, you see, only 40 years of life. But oh, what an impact for good he made. You see, it's not the length of time that we have, but it is what we use that time for. What will we be known for, when we die? My father was lying, in a semi-coma, but not a complete coma, because he was able to understand what we said. But across his body, the week before he died, I saw a righteous and a just man. And that is what I think of my father, a righteous and a just man. And so it is, you see, we have a short time upon this earth. Here I am over 80 years of age, and it seemed like nothing, so actually that I was just a boy, and now suddenly I've arrived at 80 years of age, and you get the shock of your life and say, where did those 80 years go? What have I done in that 80 years? And of course, as Paul said, our judgment lies with God, not with man. But what have we done in the years that have been appointed to us? And then it follows a time to be born and a time to die, with a time to plant and a time to pluck up. Now, it's very interesting in Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 10 that God, speaking to the prophet, tells him in no uncertain terms what his ministry will be. And he gives 4 aspects, shall I say, of rooting or breaking down. And he said it is to root out, to pull down, to destroy, and to throw down, and then to build and to plant. It's very interesting, 2 to 1. 4 aspects of rooting out, of breaking down, destroying, and throwing down, but then to build and to plant. In life, the thing that we have to pay more attention to than anything else is rooting out that which is evil. You know, it's a consideration in nature that weeds don't need to be planted, but they proliferate everywhere. They're everywhere. And it takes more time to root out weeds than it does to plant the good seed. Well, the same is in our life. The same is in life, as it were. In our own life, we've been born with this Adamic nature, and oh, how we have to cry out to God to root out those things in our life that we have because we're the descendants of Adam, and particularly because of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents whom we might not have known. But because of them, what has been implanted in our life at conception. And we have to spend our time, looking unto the Lord to root out those things. And then, of course, to plant the good seed of the Word of God, and to build a character that is a character that is sterling, that is full of integrity, righteous and just. Well, that is our life's work. And when you consider the life around us, the weeds are proliferating like anything. People have been content to allow those plants of weeds, of unrighteousness, to develop, take root in their lives and, turn, as it were, this nation and other nations into the pathway of evil, into the pathway that is contrary to the ways of God. And it is amazing how the voice of the wicked is listened to more than the voice of the righteous. I think, just reading recently, of one atheist who was objecting to the fact that there would be mention of God in the inauguration of the president. And yet he is going to be heard by a judge who will issue an order. Whether that order will be obeyed or not, I don't know. But the interesting thing is this: one voice of wickedness is allowed to be heard, whereas the voice of the righteous are often, shall I say, softened and muzzled. Well, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. We are to weep with those that weep, and we are to laugh with those that laugh. In other words, dependent upon the situation we find ourselves, we are to accommodate ourselves to the need of that time. Obviously, we weep with those that are in sorrow, and we laugh with those who, if I could say this, are experiencing the great joys and blessings of the Lord. And so it is a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get, a time to lose. And that a time to get, there used to be a time when you got stock. There was a time that one should have gotten rid of stock. But there you are, you see. And a time to cast away, a time to rend, and here's another one: a time to keep silence and a time to speak. We often speak on perfection, but what is our definition of perfection? Well, it should be the definition that the Apostle James gives. He said, "Mark the perfect man, the one who is able to control his speech," or his tongue. And there is a definition of holiness, saintliness. It's the one who can control his tongue. It's the one who can keep silent when all around people are talking about abstruse things that are just trivia. But here is the key to perfection. To know when to keep silent. It's such a wonderful, shall I say, virtue that in the book of Proverbs it makes a statement that even the fool, when he keeps silent, is esteemed a wise man. And so one of the aspects of wisdom is to control one's tongue. And then, of course, there's a time when one should speak, because there's a time when one should not hold one's silence. And one should speak out for righteousness at the given time. And so here is King Solomon giving us all this, important data. And a time to love, a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. And those things, of course, we do not control. A time of war is controlled by God, because God stirs up the enemy, as we see against Israel in the book of Judges, that the Lord stirred up the Midianites, the Lord stirred up the Canaanites, the Lord stirred up the Philistines, the Lord stirs up the enemies, because he has decreed a time of war. But the important thing is this, that we need to move in God's timetable. And then, having observed all this, Solomon asks this question. In verse 9, he said, "What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboureth?" And he asks that question. And then somehow he responds. And he says in verse 12, "I know that there is no good in them but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life." And he speaks often, this is the comment of Solomon, that, the best thing is to have a joyful countenance, a joyful heart. Joy is a wonderful thing. And if we can be joyful in the midst of tribulation, joyful in the time of darkness, joyful, in the time of battle, we have what very few people have, one of the greatest blessings of God. For it is written in chapter 2 that the man that pleaseth God, he will give wisdom, knowledge, and joy. And if you want to bless somebody and someone you love, you often select, if I could say this, the most precious gift that you can afford. Well, God is limitless in what he can do and what he can give. Does he promise gold and silver and rubies to the one that blesses him and pleases him? No. He offereth wisdom, knowledge, and joy. And what is knowledge? It's the acquiring of, shall I say, useful information that will enable one to progress in this life. But wisdom is the ability to guide that person of education. But Solomon says, well, wisdom and knowledge really does not suffice, because you have more wisdom and more knowledge, you have more sorrow. That's in the natural. But God adds joy. And it's such a wonderful thing to have the joy of the Lord, bubbling up within your heart or, in your mind, to be joyful. It's a wonderful, wonderful privilege. You can have all the other things, but if you haven't got that, well, you just haven't got what is necessary in life. And then For a man to rejoice, I'm in verse 12 again of chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes, and to do good in his life, to do good in his life, to do good. When you look back on your life, you ask yourself, certain situations in the past, did I do that which is right? Did I do my best for that person? And the interesting thing is this, that we find that God himself requireth that which is past in verse 15. And the past we cannot bring back, but we live in the present. And in the present we should live as if we were living in the future and looking back at this situation in our life. Are we doing good? When I'm older and looking back on this situation, will I be satisfied that I did that which was good? And if we have the tendency of living in the future when in the present, it does affect us tremendously. It does affect us tremendously. If you live just in the present and only in the thought of the present, you often have a tendency of doing things for your own benefit and not for the benefit of others. How do you spell joy? Jesus first, others next, yourself last. You see, and that should govern everything that we do in any given situation. Have we put Jesus first? Have we put others next and ourselves? Well, do we come last? And if we do that, you see, we will in the future look back on those given situations and say, yes, I did put Jesus first, I put others next, and then myself last, and because of that, you can have a joyful remembrance of that which you did. Well, as we continue in this, he said in verse 13 also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It says the rest of the laboring man is sweet, is sweet, is sweet. It's very interesting, that the Apostle Paul says, what do you labor for? After all, we can take nothing with us. Billy Graham had that saying, you never see a U-Haul trailer at a funeral. And all the things that we have acquired in life, we leave behind. And yet somehow we may have spent hours, days, weeks, months, perhaps years laboring for those things that we have to leave behind. Now, King Solomon, the richest man who ever lived, he said, in my kingdom, the person that is the happiest is the one who does good and just eats and drinks, and his sleep is sweet. It reminds me of another story of Cecil Rhodes. Now, Cecil Rhodes was an Englishman who, among other things, he was the founder of Rhodesia, that is now called Zimbabwe. And there were two Rhodesias, north and south. The north was Zambia and the south was Zimbabwe. Well, one of his sayings was this, there's so little time and yet so much to do. But he was in a railway carriage in England, and the only other person in the railway carriage was General William Booth. And General Booth had the tendency, the ability to get anybody on his knees. And so in this railway carriage, travelling in England, he got Cecil Rhodes kneeling and praying. And after the prayer, Cecil Rhodes said this. He said, "General, please do not cease to pray for me." And then later on, in another situation, in a social gathering of all the noble people and lords and ladies of that time, there was Cecil Rhodes amongst all the nobility and all the wealth of his time. And over in the corner was General Booth. And Cecil Rhodes made this comment. He said, "Oh, if only I had the joy and peace of that man, I would give up everything I had." Queen Elizabeth I, as she was dying amongst her maidens, her ladies in waiting, said, "Oh, I would give the whole of my kingdom for 1 hour to live, 1 hour more to live." She said, "It's getting so dark, so dark, so dark." Well, you've got to consider this. As we live, so we will die. We have the terrorists, and it says very clearly in the book of Revelation that they that live by the sword shall die by the sword. And it's so interesting how these terrorists do die. They do die through bombs or assassination and so forth. In fact, the one who was the instigator of the siege of the American embassy in Tehran was one of the first that was killed in the Iraqi war, the Iran-Iraqi war. It's very interesting, very interesting. Now, the key is to live a good life. And then something very interesting. In verse 16, "And moreover I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there. The place of righteousness, that iniquity was there." It's very interesting that, one can be in church and one can know the truths of church life and Christianity. And you can be amongst the righteous, but as it says in the book of Proverbs, I was in all evil in the midst of the congregation. It's amazing how evil people can dwell with the righteous and not change. No, it's not so much who you live with, but who you live for. There's a warning in the Apostle Paul's letter to Timothy where he said, in the last days, people will be lovers of self. Lovers of self. No, let us be lovers of Christ. And let us live for Christ. And in so doing, we shall reap all the benefits of the blessings of God, wisdom, knowledge, and joy. And here is, in verse 22, the summation of all these comments of Solomon. "Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For whom shall bring him to see what shall be hereafter?" No, we don't know what is going to follow. No, the important thing is we do good works, and we can rejoice in those good works, and we can eat, and we can drink, and we can sleep in peace. Those are the most important things in life. And that is a summation of the wisest and the richest man who ever lived. He said, "I'd really like to be like one of my laborers." You see, let us consider all these things.